Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Yousef Munayyer. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Today's conversation is going to be on the impending Israeli decision around annexation of additional occupied Palestinian territory and the potential fallout of a decision like that in the international arena among Palestinians and in the United States as well. I'm very happy to have joining me for this conversation, Zaha Hassan, who's a human rights lawyer and a visiting fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as well as Daniel Levy, who is president of the U.S. Middle East Project, an organization based in London and New York. Thank you both so much for joining us for this conversation today. So just to sort of set the stage, after a year and a half of attempts, we have now a new Israeli government, and the two sort of main competing forces have found a way to come together, in a union that was forged by fatigue and coronavirus. It seems one of the only things that they agree on in terms of a legislative priority is on this question of annexation, which was put into the coalition agreement that can be advanced in the Israeli Knesset as early as July 1st. And so this is a move that has been a long time coming, but it seems now that we are very much on the precipice of this becoming an actual legislative reality in the Israeli government system. And so obviously this is a very significant move that has long been thought of as a game changer, and yet here we are after several years of seeing Israeli decisions that were previously thought of as game changers. So I want to sort of talk with the two of you about what happens after annexation becomes a reality. What sort of are the responses that we'll see, and how do we wake up and see the situation on the day after? But before we get to the sort of fallout, Daniel, perhaps I'll begin with you and just sort of get an understanding from you about what's going into the Israeli decision calculus here. The new Netanyahu government is a slightly different sort of configuration than what we've seen in the past, but nonetheless is still very much a right-leaning government. And has agreed to put this on the table for a vote. It seems, from what I can tell, that the votes are going to be there to make this happen. So what is going into the thinking in terms of the timing of putting this forward and the scope of what annexation looks like in terms of the Israeli decision makers who are making this call?
Well, thanks a lot. And it's nice to be having this chat with two friends, with Yousef and Zaha. I'm looking forward to discussing the kind of that morning after stuff and the extent to which this is or isn't a game changer. But to kind of think about that scene setting piece on the Israeli side, I think the point of departure is that it cannot be ignored that in a coalition agreement in which these two blocs have a mutual veto on almost everything. There's stuff to do with the Israeli justice system and the Judicial Appointments Committee, which isn't our subject, which was all thrashed out in advance. But the one issue where there is not a mutual veto, and actually the one issue that the original agreement said could be put forward during 6 months when the government would only deal with the COVID-19 crisis, is the issue of annexation. As it's referred to in the agreement, the extension of Israeli sovereignty. Now, the 6-month timetable is pretty clear where that's coming from. The July 1st, why you could do it before the 6 months is up. By the way, that part of the agreement had to subsequently be scrapped because the Supreme Court said you can't limit yourself as a government to what you can legislate on. But that's a secondary thing. And that, of course, plays to the American political calendar, which brings us to the question of why now? Why is this on the agenda in the palpable way in which it is? Why is this mentioned in a coalition agreement? Why has Netanyahu repeatedly referred to this issue? He's no longer in election campaign mode. In the swearing in of the government, in the first meeting of the Likud faction, he has said this is a priority. Why now? He's been in power the longest of any Israeli prime minister. He's been in power uninterrupted now for more than a decade. He has had right-wing governments. He's had a majority in the Knesset in the past for such a move. And I don't think one can understand the answer to that question without understanding the Trump administration, which I'm sure we'll spend a little bit of time talking about. So my bottom line on this would be, Netanyahu is the same Netanyahu, ideologically committed to ensuring that the Palestinians do not achieve freedom, independence, rights, equality, that Israel has maximum control over maximum desirable territory, but also a prime minister for whom his own longevity in a system where there are no term limits is a very driving motivation. Added to that now, of course, the personal issues he faces vis-a-vis the trial in court, and a guy who is relatively risk averse, okay? Netanyahu is a hardliner who is also not an adventurist in many respects. I would simply argue that those things now align in ways that they did not in the past. That the cost calculation for Israel to undertake an act of annexation does not now look prohibitive. The kind of international reaction, obviously the kind of American reaction, the ability of the Palestinian leadership or the region to place serious problematic obstacles in the way. Therefore, it's on the agenda. Therefore, it now falls, I would argue, the decision on annexation is more likely than not. I don't think it is a given, but it falls more into the box of decisions Netanyahu will take based on an understandable, for his point of view, and not unusual set of calculations. Does this serve my interest, my broad personal political interest? It would seem that the alignment of forces is such that it's better for him to go ahead with it. But if that changes, he may well pull back. It's not something I expect. To briefly expand on the factors in there, the main party who he went in with, and you called them the main competing forces in Israel, have now come together in a government. This former chief of staff, Benny Gantz, who is the alternate prime minister, this party, blue and white, they never really offered an alternative agenda, an alternative political, ideological agenda, certainly not when it came to the Palestinians. Left to his own devices, Gantz would not do annexation. Even though he said he believed that the Jordan Valley should be annexed, he wouldn't do this on his own. But it does not seem like this is a hill they will die on as a party. That's the case at the moment. The factors that could influence this, it will be difficult to work out a scope of annexation, and we can come back and talk about that. It will be difficult to work out a scope of annexation which, on the one hand, serves his own base enough for Netanyahu, and on the other hand, minimizes that risk. I still think that is workoutable, that is doable. There will be attempts to suggest that the security consequences, potential escalation in the occupied territories, the external push against, that these would be too costly. I don't think those will look too costly to the Israeli side. And in the many factors that come into this, the other one I would just point out is, if there is one axis, central axis, in which this decision will be taken, it is the Israeli-American axis. In fact, the only condition Netanyahu has to fulfill in terms of the coalition agreement to bring forward the extension of Israeli sovereignty is that it is an agreement with the US. Every time, and this isn't an unknown quantity now, the Trump administration, this is a known quantity. Every time there has been this debate, well, maybe what they do will be really, really bad, but it won't quite cross into being excruciatingly bad. Every time there's been that debate, the excruciatingly bad has won. The excruciatingly bad is driven by the ambassador in Jerusalem, David Friedman, an extremist former settler funder. I say former, he may well still fund the settlements actually, by the evangelical dispensationalist wing, who are an important part of the Trump Republican base, and by the kind of hardline Republican Jewish coalition minority, real minority of American Jews who back Trump, who back the settlers, and the key figure there as a funder is Sheldon Adelson. So that's the axis. And I think if Bibi got cold feet at some stage, there would actually be pressure from the American side to go ahead and do annexation. Not that I'm saying he'll get cold feet necessarily.
Right, right. Yeah, I was gonna say I don't think that David Friedman will be holding him back at all. Well, thank you for that. I want to turn to you, Zaha, and talk about the players left out of that axis, the Palestinians, who are obviously going to be most directly impacted by this Israeli decision. And we saw a declaration from the head of the PLO, Mahmoud Abbas, about a week or so ago, a lengthy declaration about a number of steps that the Palestinian leadership said that they would take after the new Israeli government, which agreed on putting annexation on the agenda, was sworn in. Could you sort of walk us through what that declaration included, and also give us a sense of what good at all this might do, what actual leverage it might afford the Palestinians as this Israeli decision nears?
Thanks, Yousef, for having me, and I'm glad to be here with Daniel. So, you know, I want to step back for a second and say that, you know, we have heard this, you know, these threats before from the Palestinian Authority and from the PLO leadership with respect to cutting off relations with Israel and all kinds of threats. If Israel does X, Y, or Z, whether it's expanding settlements or this one additional settlement, or if it's, you know, annexation, we've been hearing it over the years. And there have been decisions already taken by the PLO in 2018 when they had the last PNC meeting. Decisions were taken. The PLO Executive Committee took decisions related to withdrawing recognition to Israel, related to ending security coordination with Israel, and ending, you know, economic cooperation with Israel, you know, trying to separate from Israel economically. All these things have been taken and made. Even the Fatah Central Committee, which is really the decision-making body at the moment, the de facto decision-making body at the moment, with Mahmoud Abbas at the head of that as well, has said that these are actions that need to be taken, but the implementation was always left up to the president, Mahmoud Abbas. And we have to remember, like, who is the president in Palestine? He is the original person who extended an arm out to the Israelis and tried to to find a path forward towards negotiations with Israelis before anyone thought about it, before anyone, thought it was a good idea, before the PLO was behind it. He was. And so that's why it's been such a difficult point for him to go from the decision to implementation, because his entire legacy is wrapped up in, his relationship with Israelis, and his whole legacy is wrapped up in the peace process and the PA. So to say that, at this moment he's going to end security cooperation and pursue claims against Israel and international fora, all that was not new. But the question is whether or not he's actually going to do what he said he's going to do during that last declaration. And I'm one to believe that he doesn't even have a choice at this point. I think Israel made the choice for him. There is just no way a Palestinian leader post-annexation could operate business as usual with Israelis. I don't believe that the Palestinian street's going to be okay with it. I don't think the PLO leadership's going to be okay with it. And the Fatah Central Committee is not going to be okay with it, even though there are those who, even in the Fatah Central Committee, are very concerned because there isn't a strategy that has been outlined in terms of, how to actually cut off relations with Israel. But we do at the moment see signs that the PA is moving forward. Security cooperation has been cut. The Palestinian security forces have withdrawn from areas B. Though they're still there in plain clothes, they're not allowed to carry weapons. They're not allowed to drive in with their marked vehicles. And they're not allowed to intervene openly and without coordination with Israel. So the coordination piece is gone, though they still are there, but they're plain clothes. In terms of collecting the monthly clearance revenues that Israel, supposed to deliver to the Palestinians, minus deductions that they take since 2018 for prisoner payments and martyr payments, those have stopped. Those monthly meetings have stopped. And it's unclear what that's going to mean long term. If the PA is going to allow Israel to unilaterally deposit that money without coordination from the Palestinians, and whether the Palestinians will accept it. Because the argument would be that if you're going to turn over the keys to the occupation to the occupier, then the occupier should be paying for all these things directly. In terms of permits that Israel gives Palestinians to enter Israel, the Palestinian Authority is no longer coordinating. The Civil Affairs Ministry is no longer coordinating with COGAT, the military that processes those permits. So the question is, how are Palestinians going to get their permits to go to Jerusalem and to go into Israel when they need to for work and such? That's going to have to be coordinated by a third party. They're going to look to maybe some international organization, or perhaps a third party state to coordinate that. In terms of travel, processing Palestinian travel documents and that kind of thing, again, that's going to be third party. So, we're already starting to see this disengagement. Even, COGAT now is delivering its bills, electricity bills, directly to Palestinians in Area C, which used to go through the PA. COGAT is also delivering messages to Palestinian banks about accounts, prisoner accounts, and the closing of those accounts. It's not coordinating through the Palestinian Authority. And that was happening even before President Abbas said he was going to cut off relations with Israel. So, we have all of this action being taken, and it's very preliminary, and it's not, we can't really project into the future and see whether or not this is going to last, but at least, they're now doing something beyond the threat, right? But the question remains, about the PA and its very viability. aside from, what will happen if it doesn't accept the clearance revenues, it's been hit hard over the last couple of years with respect to the deductions of the clearance revenues, with respect to now the COVID crisis, with, its revenue streams have been cut in half, and it's really not going to be very financially solvent in the coming month or two. In particular, too, I mean, there's a dependency on remittances from the Gulf, and that has been severely impacted by the drop in oil prices, and also because of the COVID. So, it's a perfect storm for the PA to sort of just dissolve of its own accord, even without the annexation, even without all of those things. So I don't even know if it's a choice anymore for the PLO to say, okay, the PA has run its course. We are now going to regroup and take back the reins of the national movement, where the PA had sort of become prominent above the PLO. I don't even know if that's a choice anymore. I feel like it may have just, it may be dying of its own, a natural death, because it's been starved of not only just because of the current situation, but over the last few years too, with the international donor community, starting to get fatigued as well. So there's going to have to be either a retooling of the PA to find a new use for it, one that sort of works on mobilizing Palestinians to be able to withstand what's coming if there is annexation. And I agree with Daniel. It's, even if the Israelis don't want it, the U.S. really wants it, and this is an election year, and it's been a windfall for this U.S. president to be able to rely on, action he takes with respect to policy towards Israel benefiting him politically, especially during this election season. So, I think that that whole process is now just starting to happen within Palestinian circles. We're starting to now see this discussion, and it's being taken much more seriously than it ever has. And for that reason, I think it's more meaningful what we're seeing in terms of President Abbas's statements today than it has ever been before.
Thank you, Zaha. Yeah, I mean, I as you were talking about all that, I wonder, for the reasons that you lay out, obviously, ending these agreements will have a real tangible impact on the lives of Palestinians, who, for whatever these agreements were worth, have, come to shape their lives around the contours of all of these policies, whether it's around permits and travel and access and where the bills come from and so on and so forth. And that change is also going to potentially come with a cost associated with it too.
And I think, I didn't mention this, but I think we need to be cognizant of, as critical as everyone has been about the PA, in this moment of pandemic, it has found a real purpose, and it has been able to lead in a way that it hasn't ever before. And so, that is something that has to be also taken into account. How do you confront this pandemic, which isn't going away, in the next month or two, if you don't have some sort of governance on the ground that can help Palestinians navigate that? And so, I'm sure all of that is weighing on sort of the path forward that the Palestinian leadership has to consider as they determine exactly what it meant when President Abbas announced he was cutting off ties. But I mean, I think the COVID really brought home for a lot of people in Palestine and abroad that, there is some need for governance. And so it's not so simple as to say, hey, just disappear,
Yeah.
we don't need you anymore.
Yeah, I think that's sort of what I was getting at, is that for all of the problems with these agreements, there will be a cost to changing things, and obviously it is a particularly terrifying moment now for Palestinians who, on top of occupation and discrimination and everything else, are dealing with the same deadly pandemic virus that the rest of the world is dealing with. And there is a need to have direction, administration, government, and public health policy, most importantly. And I wonder to what extent the population that lives under the administration of the PA will sort of tolerate these kinds of tactical moves that seem to be devoid of a bigger strategy at the moment, especially given where the Palestinian relationship is with Washington now, clearly at the lowest that it's been in a very long time, and no clear horizon for what is going to come. And that sort of brings us to Washington, and it brings us to election season, and it brings us to what may or may not happen in November. I wonder if maybe both of you can talk a little bit about how the potential change of administration in Washington is sort of factoring into the decisions around next steps for both Palestinians and Israelis. And maybe, Daniel, you talked a little bit about obviously this golden window of opportunity that the Trump administration affords Israel and has been doing for the last several years, sort of defining this timeline for annexation and explaining the why now. What might be the fallout if you have a change of guard in Washington, and how might the Israelis sort of approach that? Have we seen anything from the Biden campaign that would suggest that there would be a significant change of course vis-a-vis annexation or some of the other big issues when and if there is a change in November?
Can I circle back to that by way of a detour to occupied Palestinian territory? Because the headline from everything Zaha just shared with us that I would take away from that is how deeply and thoroughly co-opted into those Oslo structures that guarantee Palestinian disenfranchisement and inequality, the PA has become. Because you go through that list of the security cooperation and the permits and the money that's withheld. And so the question really shouldn't center around annexation, yes or no. And this is a much bigger question of what does one do with these structures that, if one is to be generous, and this is what you touched on, Yousef, these structures may in some way be helping to keep Palestinians on the ground. And one could make the argument that given the balance of power today, that is a not inconsiderable Palestinian achievement, and it means that the issue cannot go away as long as there are Palestinians there. And you understand what I'm saying there. Mm-hmm. But it really does raise the whether there's annexation or not. What does one do? And Zaha's point is very well taken. The demise of the PA may happen of its own volition, not as a conscious political act. The financial solvency, COVID crisis, everything else. My own sense is that if that is not the case, there are still sufficient interests that will bind us to the continuation of that status quo. But I think the bigger question, and I'll park this issue there, the bigger question, and I think it is why the current withdrawal of some of the security cooperation, some of the overall coordination is not being seen as sustainable, as something particularly threatening by the Israeli side. I think the reason for that is if you are going to fundamentally change how one organizes and structures Palestinian society under occupation, then you have to do just that. You have to address that entire plethora of questions, including the well-being of people, the fact that the Palestinian Authority is the largest provider of salaries. I think those questions can be addressed in a more effective way that is more disruptive and challenging to the status quo. But that is not what we're seeing. We're not seeing an entire plan for that. So I would simply caution us that the conscious withdrawal of the PA and cooperation, it's you know, a dog isn't only for Christmas. You don't withdraw the PA only as a warning over annexation. This would have to be part of a much bigger strategy. The US and how is the campaign, the potential change in administration going to play into all of this? Look, I do not, I undoubtedly think by a lot of this is being driven by claims of the political usefulness of backing annexation. Personally, I think the Trump base is with Trump anyway. I don't think he actually needs this. I think it's an argument that Adelson, the evangelical dispensationalists and others are using to advance what they believe in anyway. Likewise, I think the Biden position going softly on Israel, basically going back to the future in terms of the position, I think that at my most generous, I would say, that speaks to a misreading of electoral politics. But I'm not going to convince them on that, I don't think. What it does speak to, and this is why the fact that we're in a US election season could impact what's going on. In other words, you could reach some kind of a critical mass, a perfect storm of factors, which might make Bibi revisit that calculation of this being relatively cost-free or cost-light to do annexation. One of those would be, do I really want to do this in the face of a very clear, sharp, game-changing even message from the guy who might be president come January of next year? To the extent to which that could have played a role, the Democrat presumptive candidate has divested himself of that role because Vice President Biden has said, a bit like the Jerusalem embassy move, wrong thing, I regret it, move on. This isn't going to in any way impact our relationship. So the ability in Israel to create an echo chamber around, oh my goodness, do we really want to risk the US relationship, is non-existent. My fear is that, my fear isn't that there will be change in November, okay? My fear is that if there is that change in November, apropos of this issue, it will not be particularly felt because the old American modus operandi went something like the following. We think the Israelis, we tell the Israelis they should do something they have no intention of doing in terms of withdrawing an occupation, allowing for a Palestinian state. But we're clear to the Israelis that if they choose to disregard our position, ignore our advice on this, we will still provide them with unconditional, unique financial, political support. And it's really not very surprising that the Israeli response would be, thanks for the advice, we're totally uninterested in it, carry on with the support. And it seems like it will be a return to that equation. My takeaway, if I were, which I am, speaking to my friends in Israel who are not happy with the situation, want to see change, believe in universal values of equality, is get on with doing your own thing. support those forces in America who are trying to change the dynamics, change the debate, but don't rely on them. Don't expect the game changer to come from there. You try and change the reality that they are working with. And I think exactly the same, and more importantly, would be the advice to the Palestinians. Of course, the American boot on your throat will be removed to a significant degree if Trump is no longer there. But a Democrat president in the White House is not going to remove the principal boot on your throat, which is the one that's the occupation. So do not wait for America. Discuss all the issues we've been talking about. How do you get out of this co-opted reality? How can you be disruptive while still caring for your people? And I think that's, for me, the important takeaway is answer those questions. And I think not only will the Palestinian leadership be challenged, but also, there is the call from Palestinian civil society groups regarding annexation, and Al-aqsa has put out that call. I think, that all sounds like business as usual to me. And I fear that the international response will be business as usual. And I think civil society is going to have to rethink how it goes about its struggle as well, if I may say.
Well, I want to get to the, thank you, Daniel. I want to get to the sort of impact on civil society organizations and people who care about peace and justice and seeing that actually transpire on the ground. I did want to ask Zaha to kind of come in on this question of potential change in Washington and the way that the Palestinian leadership may be thinking about it. In 2016, it was pretty clear to anyone who was paying attention sort of who was in Trump's orbit, what their politics were, and what their Israel-Palestine policy would be. I don't think anyone was surprised by the direction that it took. And nonetheless, there was an effort by Mahmoud Abbas to sort of develop a relationship with Trump, to sort of maintain a connection with Washington in the hopes of maybe seeing something transpire there. And it seems like ages ago, but in May of 2017, they met here in the United States, and Abbas famously told him at a press conference, Mr. President, we believe you're the only one that can get this done, and you can make peace happen. We trust in you.
Famous last words.
Famous last words, right? Of course, after that, the relationship took an unprecedented nosedive. But given that, I wonder what that might tell us about the way that the leadership does think about the importance of building a relationship with whoever the occupant of the White House is, and how they're thinking about a potential change and how much hope they are putting in that. Or is it, as Daniel says, that it's not going to really make a difference for them, because it might sound different, but ultimately the leverage needed to shift Israeli policy is not going to come from a Biden administration. How do you think the Palestinian leadership is looking at November and a potential change of administrations?
I don't want to even begin to guess what the Palestinian leadership's thinking, because all the signs we're getting right now is that they're going back to old models of sort of conflict resolution and management. We're talking about reactivating the quartet, things like that. That's what the Palestinian leadership has been focused on, and getting sort of Moscow engaged, back, to get negotiations going. And so, I mean, that's the solution. And I think that they really believe that annexation, once it happens, regardless of a change in the administration, is going to be, a game changer. It's not something that you can recover from, because the truth of the matter is, as Daniel noted, a Biden administration is not going to reverse much of what has already taken place. And truth be told, much of what has happened during these these Trump years has been made permanent by congressional action that is going to be impossible to reverse. Biden, to me, is, as problematic as the Obama administration was in terms of their very permissive attitude towards Israeli settlement expansion with no consequences, while at the same time rewarding Israel with historic amounts of security assistance for the next 10 years. As problematic as Obama was, the context has so changed today that for Biden to go back to the good old Obama years, where you can just simply, issue statements opposed to certain Israeli actions and think that's enough, is not going to fly anymore. And if you look at sort of what are the pillars of the Biden policy, it's like a series of no's. No conditioning aid to Israel, regardless of what Israel does. No public condemnations of Israel, regardless of what it does. We can talk in private, basically. And no international consequences will be allowed to go forward, whether legal, diplomatic, or economic, not on the US watch, with Biden. And no criticism of Israel can take place in the US or in other fora. The US will be there and will re-engage in international fora just for the purpose. This is Biden. He's going to re-engage in international fora that Trump has pulled back from just so he can protect Israel. My God. Okay, so if that's the case, do you really believe a Biden is going to expend political capital to de-recognize the Israeli sovereignty if it's extended into parts of the West Bank? He won't do it. He's not going to expend his capital that way. Not when he has a history of, this tight relationship with Israel, and not when it's a loser issue for him. He's been around long enough to know that it's a loser. You don't win by engaging. And right now there's a lot of argument being pushed in DC circles that we shouldn't be engaged. There's no added value to U.S. engagement, but at the same time, no one's really seriously talking about recommending conditioning aid to Israel. So this is the reality that the Palestinians are operating in, regardless of whether there's a change in administration. The damage will have been done, and there will be little prospect of reversal of the most problematic actions to the Palestinian Authority, which would be annexation. Because with annexation, there is no justification for a PA, and so that reflection is going to have to take place, as I talked about earlier, and that's going to be the damage that will have been done. And if you think about it, we are at this moment right now in U.S. policy in which we've gone back to basics. If you think about how the relationship with the Palestinians started, it started with trying to get the U.S. to recognize the PLO as a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, right? That was what, it took decades to get to that. And now we're at the moment when we're actually reversing that, where the PA is the point of contact, and PLO has become delegitimized, and it's back to being a terrorist organization, and and that's how U.S. is treating it. It can't even have an office here anymore, and it's under law, it's still a terror group. So we're back to these basics, and now the PA is about to dissolve. So what does that mean for Palestinian representation? To me, that's the more fundamental question.
Zaha, I definitely agree with you in terms of what seems to be the inclinations of Biden as a sort of traditional politician who will not want to touch this issue, and compounding that is the fact that his priorities coming in, if he were to win the election, is probably still dealing with an unprecedented economic crisis, probably still a pandemic virus, and on the international front, an apology tour that's going to make the post George W. Bush rebuilding of American ties with the world look like child's play. So it's hard to see how there's going to be much energy or focus devoted to trying to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian issue from a potential Biden administration. But that, and this sort of brings me to the last question here before we close. That suggests to me that there is going to be something of a conflict and perhaps even a clash between the potential Biden administration and many of the forces among the Democratic base, which have been pushing for a more critical approach to the U.S.-Israel relationship, and have been highlighting the need to advance Palestinian rights. And I wonder, I'd like to hear briefly from both of you before we close, how you see the potential annexation that is coming changing the way that the conversation among civil society actors who are engaged in trying to create progressive change in U.S. policy on this issue, how that decision is going to impact that conversation, and what, if any, new possibilities it may open up for advocacy. Daniel, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, your bandwidth question vis-a-vis where we are, COVID crisis, implications, is also going to apply to energy and civil society. We just have to acknowledge that, not be downhearted by it. Number two, I do just want to urge a note of caution about annexation as a game changer, in at least two ways. Number one, it implies that absent annexation, if Netanyahu makes the decision, the constellation of factors err on the side of it being better for him not to annex, we're not in a good place. All the bad stuff continues. And it could even get worse. We could be worse without annexation than with annexation, because there'd be a degree of goodwill. It would be, oh, wow, we dodged that bullet. Now, there's even more openness for them to do their worst. So there's annexation will put the issue back on people's agenda more than it was for a period of time. And people might even listen to us having this conversation. But let's not confuse that with dodging annexation being, breathe out heavily.
Daniel, just to stop you for a quick second, when I said a game changer, I meant for the PA. It's a game changer for the PA, but not necessarily. It's business as usual, really, for Palestinians in general. But just to clarify.
Yeah. By the way, and we probably won't go further into this, but I'm more sanguine than you on what it means for the PA. I can see a continued PA post-annexation if it happens. On this question of Biden, look, I'm a firm believer that yes, it matters who's in charge, but the people, of course, do not operate in a vacuum, and that applies also to Biden, of course, and it applied to Trump. Without, who knows where it would have gone without the evangelicals, dispensationalists, Sheldon, and etc. That absence of a vacuum, the fact that there are other pressures out there, is relevant for those organizing inside American society. It's relevant for what the Palestinians do. It's relevant for what others do. By the way, and probably with very good reason, none of us has mentioned the region. None of us has mentioned Jordan. None of us has mentioned other neighboring countries, Muslim countries. Right now, that is not a factor driving this. That isn't necessarily going to be the case forever. So I would close by saying that there will be a real temptation, if there is annexation, there will be a real temptation the morning after to say, whatever the annexation is, business as usual. Annexation doesn't change anything when it comes to the ability to achieve two states, when it comes to the need to go back to the peace process. Maybe a future administration dangles some financial assistance in front of the authority to get them back to the table. That would be to double down on everything that has failed thus far. And of course, annexation shouldn't change the fact that there is no conditionality in the US-Israel relationship. And I think that's the challenge. I think the challenge is to resist that temptation. There are some for whom that is easy. It is obvious. But there's a whole, I would say, a whole middle ground doesn't really capture it, but I'll use that for the moment. That we need to be speaking to, we need to be explaining this to, that needs to understand, to my mind, part of the fact that the sky won't fall, I think, the day after annexation is because for so many actors, the end of two states has already been discounted. And I think people have to focus their minds on where has Israeli impunity got us? Where do we go if we want to try and achieve equality? And it's not about the end game. It's not about whether this is one state or two states. It's about going about this whole thing a totally different way. And that's a challenge for Palestinians and Israelis who care as much as it is for Americans. And I think that's the space in which to try and do things differently.
And it seems to me that this sort of difference between you and Zaha and what it might mean for the PA is sort of one of the biggest question marks in how things move forward from here. I mean, you can see how a genuine shift in what the PA position is towards this issue can have a ripple effect on so many other actors. In many ways, the PA is the last Jenga block holding up this crumbling structure that has somehow limped into 2020. Zaha, I'm going to have you sort of give us the last word on your perspective on what potential shifts this can mean for those involved in advocacy on these issues.
Sure. I mean, I think I agree with a lot of what Daniel was saying. I think there's another Jenga block besides the PA that people haven't really factored in completely, and that's the Palestinian reaction. The people on the ground, and how are they going to deal post-annexation? Okay, yes, life will go on as usual in terms of Israeli actions on the ground. So they've been living through that. But what was different before annexation for Palestinians was this idea that maybe there was going to be a resolution to the conflict that would be negotiated, and that's why the PA was there. And so there was some level of there was some constructive deniability about what was really happening. But people post-annexation will not have that hope anymore, or tolerance for any kind of idea that they should be just quiet as the bulldozers keep rolling through their homes and their land. So we kind of saw a preview of this with respect to Israeli actions in Jerusalem in 2015 that led then to lone wolf actions at checkpoints, and sort of this renewed idea of Palestinian resistance. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to see necessarily a violent reaction over time, but there's not going to be a PA that's going to be holding people back in the post-annexation. They're not going to be doing that. They're already stopping turning over weapons that they collect in area B to the Israelis or area A. They're not doing that anymore. So that's some sign that they may not be so ready then to hold back Palestinian demonstrators or Palestinians who want to engage in some kind of resistance in the future. And that could be a game changer in terms of what's going to happen with respect to the conflict. I don't want to end on a negative note, though, because if you think that's negative to have more resistance. But I mean, we're already seeing with the COVID crisis that there is Palestinian energy and organizing and taking leadership roles in the response to COVID. And that could be sort of the germ, you know, the very early stage of what we might see in a Palestinian response on the ground, civil society response on the ground to what's coming. And that could be quite interesting, and that could really be the real game changer in all of this, is how are Palestinians going to respond to the fact that there is no possibility of a negotiated solution? What does that mean for them, knowing the constraints that they have living under occupation, and how that isn't going to change, and it's only going to get worse because of the global economic crisis that's now following the pandemic?
Well, I know that we will all be watching over the next several weeks and several months very closely to see what the fallout of all of this is going to be. Thank you, Zaha, for that closing comment and for your participation. And Daniel, thank you both as well. This has been a really interesting conversation, and we are going to be having a much deeper conversation on the threat of Israeli annexation, the regional and international implications as well at the Arab Center, Washington, on Wednesday, June 3rd at 10:30 a.m. Eastern. So for those who are interested in hearing more in depth, that would be something to definitely check out. Zaha, Daniel, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to talking to you some point again in the future. Take care.
Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Take care.
Bye-bye.